Think you know World War I. You know, the assassination, the trenches, the treaties. That's the textbook version. But what if I told you the real story of the Great War is stranger, darker, and full of secrets that were deliberately buried? We're talking about phantom armies appearing on the battlefield, powerful men orchestrating the slaughter from the shadows, and scandals so dark they were practically erased from the history books. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain. We're not just looking at the war. We're exposing its deepest secrets. These are the shocking truths that were never supposed to see the light of day. The reality of this war is far more twisted than you ever imagined. Let's start in August 1914 on the battlefields of Mons, Belgium. The British Expeditionary Force is in its first major fight, and it's a disaster. Hopelessly outnumbered, they're getting hammered by the German advance and are forced into a long, bloody retreat. The official story back home was one of heroic resistance. But on the front lines, a much stranger tale began to take root among the exhausted, shell-shocked soldiers. It was a story of a miracle. Men claimed they saw heavenly visions, angels in white, holding flaming swords, standing between them and the Germans, halting the enemy in their tracks. Some even said it was St. George himself, leading phantom bowmen from the Battle of Agincourt, raining down spectral arrows on the Kaiser's troops. This was the legend of the Angels of Mons. It spread like wildfire, a glimmer of hope in a time of absolute slaughter. For millions, it was proof that God was on the side of the Allies. But what if the miracle was actually born from a piece of fiction? The truth isn't a conspiracy from the top. It's a fascinating and cynical story about how a lie can become truth. The legend didn't start on the battlefield, but in the pages of a London newspaper. On September 29, 1914, a horror and fantasy author named Arthur Machen published a short story called The Bowman. It was a fictional piece inspired by the battle, telling the tale of ghost archers saving the British. Machen never intended it to be taken as fact, but in a nation desperate for good news, it was. Parish magazines reprinted it, people whispered it in pubs, and soon Machane's fiction was being reported as fact. He was flooded with letters asking for his sources, and repeatedly had to insist he made the whole thing up. But it was too late. The story was too good, too comforting. It had already evolved from ghostly archers into full-fledged angels. Now, this doesn't mean propagandists didn't see an opportunity. Men like Brigadier General John Charteris, a master of British propaganda, were more than happy to let the rumor flourish to boost morale. Years later, in his memoirs, Charteris even tried to take credit for inventing the story himself, a claim historians now believe was a self-aggrandizing lie, proven by analysis of his own falsified diary entries. So, the first dark secret of World War I isn't a government plot. It's the story of how a fictional tale, born from an author's imagination, was so powerful that a desperate public and shell-shocked soldiers willed it into existence, creating a myth more potent than the truth. A fabricated miracle is a strange secret, a manipulation of faith for the purposes of war. But some secrets aren't created in the minds of men. They're simply swallowed by the sea, leaving behind nothing but an eerie silence. One of the war's most chilling mysteries starts on March 4, 1918. That's the last day anyone laid eyes on the USS Cyclops. This thing was a beast in nearly 550-foot-long Navy collier ship, a workhorse designed to haul coal. Once America entered the war, it was a vital part of the fleet. In early 1918, the Cyclops was loaded with 11,000 tons of manganese ore from Brazil, a key ingredient for making steel. After a stop in Barbados, it sent its last message: "Weather fair, all well." Then, somewhere on its way to Baltimore, the USS Cyclops, along with its 306 crew and passengers, vanished. It didn't just sink, it disappeared. No SOS, no wreckage, no lifeboats, no oil slicks, absolutely nothing. The U.S. Navy launched a massive search, but it was as if the Atlantic had just erased the ship. President Woodrow Wilson later said, "Only God and the sea know what happened to the great ship." Without evidence, theories ran wild. The obvious culprit was a German U-boat, but German naval records, even after the war, showed no submarines in that area and no record of an attack. Another theory pointed to the ship itself. Some naval engineers flagged a potential structural flaw. The long I-beams supporting the hull could be corroded by certain cargoes, and the heavy manganese ore might have put too much strain on it, causing the ship to snap and sink in an instant. This theory got a chilling boost when two of the Cyclops' sister ships, the Proteus and the Nereus, also vanished without a trace in the same area during World War II, carrying similar heavy ore. And then there's the location. The ship's route took it right through the heart of what would later become infamous as the Bermuda Triangle, adding a layer of paranormal fuel to the fire. But the most sinister theory involved its captain, George W. Worley, a man with rumored German sympathies, leading to speculation that he'd betrayed his country and sailed the ship straight to the enemy. The disappearance of the USS Cyclops remains the single largest non-combat loss of life in U.S. naval history. A ghost ship whose fate is a secret the ocean has kept for over a century. But it wasn't just ships that vanished. On the other side of the world, an empire's fortune disappeared into the chaos. Before the war, Imperial Russia had one of the largest gold reserves on the planet. When the Russian Revolution ignited in 1917, the anti-communist White Army seized the imperial gold to keep it from the Bolsheviks. They loaded hundreds of tons of gold bullion onto a train and hauled it across Siberia. But in the fog of the Russian Civil War, the White Army's leader was defeated. And while some of the gold was eventually returned to the new Soviet government, a huge portion of it was gone. An estimated 235 to 400 million rubles worth of gold bullion had simply vanished. So where did it go? The theories are as vast as Russia itself. One persistent legend claims it was lost in a train derailment, buried forever at the bottom of Siberia's frigid lake by coal. Another story, from a former soldier, says that boxes of gold were buried near a remote train station, a location the Soviets could never find. A more likely explanation is that the gold was sold off to fund the war effort, used as collateral for weapons from foreign banks, or siphoned off by retreating armies. Much like the USS Cyclops, the lost Romanov gold is a glittering prize that disappeared into the fog of war, its final resting place, one of history's most valuable secrets. While some secrets were lost to the ocean depths and Siberian snows, others were playing out in the shadows of Europe's grand cities. This was a war fought not just in trenches, but in back alleys and hotel barza. Secret war of spies, seductresses, and saboteurs. The Great War was the birthplace of modern espionage. Agencies like Britain's new MI5 and Germany's Naval Intelligence Service waged a relentless clandestine war that was just as critical as any battle. And in this shadow world, no name is more infamous than Mata Hari. Born in the Netherlands, Margaretha Zell reinvented herself in Paris as Mata Hari, an exotic dancer from the East. She was a sensation, a courtesan who moved through the highest echelons of society, taking powerful lovers from across Europe. When the war started, her international connections made her a person of interest. The official story is that Mata Hari was a deadly German spy, codename H21. She was accused of using her seductive powers to get military secrets from Allied officers and pass them to the Germans. In 1917, the French arrested her, put her on trial, and executed her by firing squad. But the truth is a much darker tale of betrayal and scapegoating. While Mata Hari did take money from a German diplomat, she always said it was as a lover, not a spy. In fact, she later agreed to spy for France against the Germans. But the French case against her was incredibly flimsy. The accusation that she was responsible for the deaths of 50,000 soldiers was a gross exaggeration pushed by the prosecution with no evidence to back it up. Her trial was a Shama-closed military tribunal, where her lawyer wasn't even allowed to cross-examine key witnesses. So why was she killed? Because in 1917, France was losing the war. The army was on the verge of collapse from mass mutinies, and the government desperately needed someone to blame. Mata Hari, the immoral foreign seductress, was the perfect scapegoat. She was executed on October 15, 1917, famously refusing a blindfold. Her unclaimed body was donated to science, and her head, which was preserved in a Paris museum, mysteriously disappeared years later. Most historians now agree she was, at worst, a low-level informant who provided useless gossip and, at best, a tragic victim of wartime paranoia. While Mata Hari was a scapegoat, other female spies were very real. Women like the Belgian saleswoman Gabrielle Petit passed critical intelligence on German troop movements to the British before she was caught and executed in 1916. A forgotten hero of the Shadow War. This secret war wasn't just about information, it was about destruction. And the most devastating act of sabotage on American soil happened before the U.S. even joined the war. On July 30, 1916, a massive explosion ripped through the sky over New York Harbor. The source was Black Tom Island, a munitions depot packed with over 2 million pounds of ammunition waiting to be shipped to the Allies. The blast was catastrophic, registering as high as a 5.5 on the Richter scale and felt as far away as Maryland. It killed several people, injured hundreds, and shattered windows across Manhattan. Shrapnel pelted the Statue of Liberty, causing significant damage. The arm holding the torch was so badly wounded that it has been closed to the public ever since. A decision reinforced by safety concerns about the structure. Initially ruled an accident, the truth was far more sinister. It was a carefully planned act of terrorism by German agents. At the time, America was neutral, and there was no real intelligence community to handle foreign sabotage, though Germany's responsibility was eventually pieced together. They didn't finish paying for the damages until 1953. The Black Tom explosion was a brutal secret attack that helped push a reluctant nation toward war and led directly to the creation of the Espionage Act. Sabotage and espionage are secrets of strategy. But perhaps the darkest secrets of all aren't about what states do to each other, but what the war did to the minds of the men who fought Itand, how that suffering was systematically denied and hidden from sight. The official image of the World War I soldier is one of stoic bravery. The hidden reality was one of unrelenting horror. It was a new kind of industrial slaughter that produced a new kind of injury, one with no visible wound. Soldiers developed uncontrollable tremors, tics, and stutters. They were struck blind or deaf for no physical reason. Others were rendered mute, trapped in a state of paralyzing anxiety, plagued by nightmares. The soldiers coined a term for it: shell shock. They believed the concussive force of exploding shells was literally rattling their brains. Today, we'd call it post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. But back then, the military leadership saw it very differently. To them, shell shock was not a medical condition. It was cowardice, a lack of moral fiber, or just faking it to get out of duty. This became one of the war's most shameful secrets. Instead of being treated as casualties, thousands of men suffering severe psychological trauma were accused of weakness. While a few pioneering doctors, like Charles Myers, argued it was a real psychological injury, they were often overruled. The official response was brutal. The goal wasn't to heal soldiers, but to get them back to the front. Many treatments were just torture, designed to force men to suppress their symptoms through pain. Doctors used agonizing electrical shocks on a soldier's throat to cure mutism, or on their limbs to stop tremors. During the Battle of the Somme in 1916, the number of psychiatric casualties was staggering, creating what the High Command feared was an epidemic of cowardice. In response, the British Army took an even harder line. In 1917, the term shell shock was effectively banned as an official diagnosis, and its mention was restricted in official records to prevent soldiers from being evacuated for psychological reasons. You were expected to just get over it. The most tragic result of this policy was execution. Over 300 British and Commonwealth soldiers were shot for cowardice or desertion. It's now widely believed that a significant number of these men weren't cowards. They were suffering from severe, untreated shell shock. They were men whose minds had been broken by horror, only to be killed by their own side. For decades, this secret was buried, and it wasn't until these men were finally pardoned posthumously that this dark chapter was truly acknowledged. Hiding the psychological toll of war was a dark secret born from ignorance. But what happens when the secret isn't about hiding the truth, but about manufacturing a new one? What happens when a government decides to control the very thoughts and emotions of an entire country? When the U.S. entered the war in April 1917, President Woodrow Wilson had a problem. He'd just won re-election with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." The country was deeply isolationist. How do you convince a reluctant public to send its sons to die in Europe? Wilson's answer was one of the most powerful propaganda machines in history. The Committee on Public Information, or CPI, led by a journalist named George Creel. The CPI's mission was, in his words, a vast enterprise in salesmanship. The product was war. The CPI was a government agency dedicated to manipulating public opinion on a massive scale. It churned out pro-war movies and iconic posters like Uncle Sam's "I Want You" for U.S. Army. It distributed millions of pamphlets disguised as news stories that newspapers were pressured to publish. One of its most ingenious creations was the 4-Minute Men. This was an army of 75,000 volunteer speakers who would show up anywhere a crowd was gathered: movie theaters, union halls, churches, and give passionate 4-minute pro-war speeches. Creel boasted that, over the war, they delivered more than 7.5 million speeches to a cumulative audience of over 300 million. But the CPI's work had a much darker side. It didn't just promote patriotism, it weaponized hatred. To dehumanize the enemy, CPI posters showed German soldiers as monstrous, Applich Huns with bloody bayonets, alongside captions like "Destroy this mad brute." This propaganda fueled a wave of vigilante violence against German Americans. This was all backed by the law. The Espionage and Sedition Acts made it a crime to criticize the war or the government. Dissent was outlawed. This wasn't about informing the public. It was about controlling them. The CPI pioneered techniques in mass persuasion that would be studied and refined by advertisers and future totalitarian regimes for the next century. This raises a final, unsettling question. The official reasons for the war are well known, but some historians argue that powerful hidden forces may have deliberately steered the world toward conflict. Theories range from claims that international bankers funded both sides to profit from the bloodshed, to the insidious stab Bindobak myth that blamed Jews and socialists for Germany's defeat, a lie later exploited by the Nazis. While many of these ideas are extreme, they touch on a disturbing possibility that the war may not have been an unavoidable accident. The secret alliances, the massive arms race, and the aggressive politics of Europe's leaders created a tinderbox where war became desirable for those in power. The existence of a machine like the CPI proves that governments knew that to get their war, they had to keep the darkest secrets of all their true motives and the real human cost hidden from the very people they sent to die. From phantom angels on the battlefield to ghost ships on the high seas, from the execution of a scapegoat spy to the secret suffering of shell-shocked soldiers, and finally, to the government machinery built to sell a war to a skeptical world. The Great War wasn't just a conflict of armies. It was a war of secrets and lies, of mysteries that remain unsolved and truths that were deliberately buried. The history we learn is often a simplified, sanitized version of events. The reality is always more complex, more human, and infinitely darker. It makes you wonder, what other secrets are still out there waiting to be revealed?